Linda sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills in front of her. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the silence of her small apartment. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, working hard at her retail job to support herself. But now, as she faced the harsh reality of being unable to work due to her health issues, the weight of uncertainty was pressing down on her with every passing day. For the past few months, Linda had been battling severe back pain, which made it nearly impossible to stand for long periods of time. As a cashier at a busy retail store, the strain was too much to bear. Her doctor had recommended rest, and Linda, reluctantly, had taken the decision to stop working for the time being. Thankfully, she had applied for disability benefits through the Social Security Administration, SSA, expecting to receive financial assistance to help cover her basic expenses while she recovered. At first, the process had seemed straightforward. Linda filled out the required forms online, submitted her medical documentation, and waited for confirmation that her benefits would be processed. The SSA had assured her that her case would be handled promptly, and that the assistance would arrive within a few weeks, but as the weeks turned into months, Linda began to notice something unsettling. The check she was expecting hadn't arrived. She called the SSA's hotline multiple times, each time getting a different excuse, first that her case was in process, then that there was a backlog due to high volume, and finally, the dreaded news that the department had been short-staffed due to recent changes. The person on the other end of the line had apologized, but Linda could hear the weariness in their voice as if they, too, were tired of explaining the same thing over and over. The news of President Trump's decision to cut back on SSA staff had come as a shock to Linda. She hadn't fully understood the impact it would have on her, but now it was painfully clear. The staff reductions meant that the SSA was understaffed and overwhelmed, and Linda's case had been placed on the back burner. Each day that passed without a solution brought more anxiety. The bills kept piling up, and Linda couldn't keep borrowing money from her friends and family. She felt embarrassed, ashamed, and increasingly isolated as the weight of her financial struggles mounted. She had always been the one to help others. Over the years, she had loaned money to friends who were going through tough times, hosted family gatherings at her place, and been a dependable shoulder to lean on. But now, she was the one who needed help, and that realization stung. Linda had no idea how much longer she could keep asking for favors. Her friends had been kind, offering small loans here and there, but she could feel the strain on their patience. Her sister, who lived across town, had offered to send money too, but Linda hated having to rely on her. She hated feeling like a burden. The financial strain was affecting everything in her life. She couldn't afford to buy food without using her credit cards, and even then, she was careful not to max them out. Her medication for her back pain was running low, and she didn't know how she would be able to refill it without the promised disability payments. Each day, Linda felt like she was walking on a tightrope, trying to balance the demands of life with the crushing uncertainty of her situation. She glanced at her phone, where a missed call notification from the SSA appeared. Her heart sank. Every time she tried to follow up, it felt like the same frustrating cycle: unanswered questions, long wait times, and nothing concrete. She had even considered visiting the local SSA office in person, but she knew that was just as futile. From what she'd heard, the lines were long, and there were more people than ever waiting for their cases to be handled. Linda pushed her chair back and walked over to the window, looking out at the busy street below. People were going about their day, oblivious to the struggles she was facing. She used to be like them, carefree, managing her own life. But now, everything felt out of control. The longer she had to wait, the more desperate the situation became. Her independence was slipping away, and with it, her sense of security. As Linda stared out the window, she wondered how long it would take for the SSA to get to her case. How many more days of stress, embarrassment, and worry could she handle before she broke? There was no clear answer, only the gnawing fear that, unless something changed, her life would be stuck in a never-ending waiting game. Days blurred together as Linda waited for her benefits to be processed. The frustration grew with each passing day as she watched her bills accumulate and her savings dwindle. She had always been good at managing her money. But now, with her income on hold, she found herself scrambling to make ends meet. The reality of her situation set in with a heavy weight. The cost of her rent, utilities, and medication was taking a toll, and every phone call to SSA felt like another dead end. Linda's apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The four walls seemed to close in on her as she spent more time in front of the computer, trying to navigate the endless bureaucracy of government assistance programs. Each online search for help brought more questions than answers. The patient assistance program sounded promising, but Linda didn't know if they would be enough to cover the growing expenses. Every answer seemed more complicated than the last. At night, when the silence in her apartment was the loudest, Linda lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to calculate how long she could hold on without getting paid. She had always prided herself on her ability to provide for herself. To never rely too heavily on others. But now, Linda was stuck in a constant cycle of asking for help from friends and family. She hated feeling like a burden, but what choice did she have? Linda had borrowed money from her brother and a few close friends to cover rent and bills, but it was becoming clear that this could only go on for so long. She could feel the strain in her relationships, the unspoken pressure that came with constantly needing help. It made her feel weak, something she had never been. Her independence had always been a cornerstone of who she was, but now it seemed like that was slipping away. One morning, Linda finally decided to take a step she had been avoiding. She made another call to SSA. She had already tried numerous times, but something told her she needed to push harder. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before someone picked up. Social Security Administration, how may I assist you today? The voice on the other end asked, polite but distant. Linda swallowed her frustration. Hi, I've been waiting for my disability benefits for over a month now. I was told there's been a delay because of staff reductions. Is there any way to speed up my case? I really need the assistance to cover basic living expenses. There was a long pause before the representative responded. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. We're working as quickly as possible to process all requests. However, given the current staffing situation, it may take longer than expected. Unfortunately, I don't have any updates on your specific case at this time. Linda clenched her fists, trying to keep her voice steady. But I'm living on borrowed money. I can't keep asking my friends and family for help. You have to understand, I need something more concrete than "we're working on it," the representative sighed. I understand, ma'am. I can escalate your case to a supervisor, but I cannot guarantee that it will expedite the process. You'll receive a notification once a decision has been made. I recommend that you check back in a few days. Linda felt the blood rush to her face in frustration. A few days? I've already been waiting a month. How much longer can I wait? I can't just keep living like this. But the line had gone quiet, the representative's patience clearly stretched thin. Linda hung up before she said something she might regret, her heart pounding in her chest. She had hoped for something more, a solution, a real answer, but all she had gotten was more waiting. That afternoon, Linda found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper in front of her. She had always been someone who could plan for the future. Who could make things work. But now, every decision felt like a gamble. Should she continue to rely on her family? Should she risk everything and dip into her savings even more? But what if it wasn't enough? What if her savings ran out before her case was even processed? Linda sighed, pushing the paper aside. She wasn't just fighting to survive financially anymore. She was fighting to preserve her dignity, to hold on to the part of herself that had always been strong and self-reliant. But every day that passed without a resolution chipped away at that sense of security. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing mind. Linda knew she had to find a way to make it through this difficult period, but at that moment, the uncertainty felt overwhelming. She had always been in control, but now, that control was slipping away, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The weight of the waiting game had finally begun to take its toll on Linda. Every day felt like a slow, dragging march, each minute stretching longer than the last. She had hoped that, after a few phone calls and applications, things would start to fall into place. But as the days turned into weeks, Linda's patience was wearing thin. The SSA had given her nothing but empty promises, and the financial hole she found herself in was becoming deeper with each passing day. She had already borrowed money from her friends and family, and while they had been generous, she could feel the strain. The phone calls were fewer now, too much time had passed, and Linda didn't want to be the one constantly asking. She hated that feeling of being beholden to others. She had always been the one to lend a hand, never the one to take. But now, she had no choice. Linda spent her mornings at the small kitchen table, sorting through the bills that had begun to pile up, electricity, rent, and the increasing cost of her medications. Each envelope she opened felt like a punch to the stomach. The rent for her apartment was due, and she had nothing to cover it. Her savings had been stretched thin already, and without her SSA benefits, she didn't know how much longer she could make it. The uncertainty gnawed at her. It was a chilly Tuesday morning when Linda decided to visit her local SSA office in person. The phone calls had been fruitless, and perhaps, face to face, she would get the answers she needed. She gathered her things, made sure her jacket was on straight, and walked out the door, determined to confront the issue head-on. The walk to the SSA office was about 20 minutes from her apartment, but as Linda made her way down the busy street, it felt like the longest walk of her life. The city bustled around her, cars honking, people rushing to work, and the hum of everyday life continuing as if nothing was wrong. But inside, Linda was anxious, each step filled with doubt and fear of what she would find when she arrived. What if they didn't have an answer for her? What if she had to wait even longer? Arriving at the SSA office, Linda stood in front of the building, its stark, utilitarian architecture reflecting the cold, impersonal nature of the bureaucracy inside. The line outside the office was long, people stood in silence, clutching forms and applications, just like Linda. It wasn't a comforting sight, but it was a familiar one. This was the reality of the system she had been thrust into, and she had no choice but to follow along. Inside the office, the line moved slowly. Linda took a seat and waited, watching as others were called to the counter. A young woman in front of her was speaking with a clerk, explaining her situation with frustration in her voice. It wasn't hard to see that the woman had been through this 1,000 times. Linda listened, wondering how many others like her were facing the same uncertainty, trapped in a system that had failed them. When Linda's turn finally came, she walked up to the counter, trying to steady her nerves. The clerk behind the desk was polite but distant, not offering much more than a brief greeting. She handed him her ID and the paperwork she had filled out weeks ago. "I've been waiting for a decision on my disability benefits," Linda said, keeping her voice calm despite the frustration rising within her. "I've been told there's a backlog, but I'm really in a difficult situation. I can't afford to wait much longer." The clerk nodded and typed on his keyboard. "Let me check your file, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. Linda watched as he clicked through several screens, his expression unreadable. He glanced up at her. "It appears there is still no update on your case. The delay is due to the current staff reductions. Unfortunately, we can't expedite the process. You'll need to wait for a formal decision." Linda's heart sank. She had been hoping for something different, a solution. An answer, anything. But this was what she had feared the most: more waiting, more uncertainty. "I've been waiting for over a month," Linda said, her voice cracking slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "How long is this going to take? I can't keep living like this." The clerk looked at her, his face sympathetic but cold. "I understand, ma'am, but there's nothing I can do. Please check back in a few weeks. That's all the information I have for you." Linda felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. She turned away from the desk, her legs feeling weak beneath her as she walked back to the waiting area. The space around her felt even colder now. She was just another face in a crowd of people, all waiting for something that might never come. As she stepped out of the building, the harsh reality of the situation hit her again. The uncertainty she had been living with for weeks was now confirmed. She was stuck in a system that had no answers for her, no help, and no urgency to make things right. Walking back down the street, Linda felt a deep sense of loss. She had always been able to rely on herself, but now, that safety net was gone. She was at the mercy of a system that seemed indifferent to her needs, and there was no clear path forward. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and Linda wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting it alone. The following days were a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Linda's visit to the SSA office had left her feeling defeated, but it also solidified the reality she had been trying to ignore: the system was broken, and there was little she could do to speed it up. She felt like a cog in a machine too large and indifferent to her personal struggle. The days seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next, filled with the same thoughts and worries. Linda had always been a fighter, someone who could deal with adversity head-on. But this was different. This wasn't something she could solve with hard work, determination, or a positive attitude. This was a game of waiting, a game where the rules were beyond her control. With her disability benefits still in limbo, Linda's options had become scarce. Her rent was due again, and she had no idea how she was going to pay it. She hadn't been able to afford her medication in weeks, relying on what little remained in her cabinet, and her back pain was getting worse. The pain was constant. A dull ache that never quite went away, and there was no way she could see a doctor without the benefits to cover the cost. She tried to stretch what little money she had, but it was never enough. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to turn off the constant stream of thoughts that raced through her mind. What would happen if her case wasn't approved? Would she have to move? Could she even afford to buy food in a week or two? The thought of asking for help from family again was unbearable. She didn't want to burden anyone any more than she already had. One evening, Linda sat in her small kitchen, eating the last of her frozen vegetables, trying to make them last as long as possible. She had already cancelled her phone plan and cut back on every unnecessary expense. She felt as though she was living on borrowed time, waiting for something that might never come. She couldn't keep living like this. As she cleaned up her dishes, Linda heard the knock at the door. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. She opened the door, half expecting to see a delivery person or maybe a neighbor. Instead, she was greeted by two police officers, standing in the hallway of her building, their faces neutral but serious. "Ms. Linda Carter?" One of the officers asked. "Yes, that's me," Linda replied, her voice shaky. "Is there a problem?" The officer nodded. "We're here regarding your outstanding rent payment. We've received a notice from your landlord that you haven't paid, and we need to discuss your options moving forward." Linda felt her heart drop into her stomach. She had known this moment would come. She had tried everything, making calls, borrowing from friends, even cutting back on essentials, but the weight of it was too much. She hadn't been able to pay her rent in 2 months, and now it was catching up with her. She hadn't anticipated the officer's visit, but deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before it happened. "I'm doing the best I can," Linda said, her voice tight. "I've been waiting for my disability benefits to come through, but they haven't processed yet. I just need a little more time." The officers exchanged a glance, and the second officer spoke. "We understand, ma'am. But your landlord has filed for eviction, and the process can't be delayed any longer. You need to either pay the rent or find another solution." Linda felt a rush of panic rise within her. She didn't know what to do. She had no money to pay the rent, and the SSA was still dragging its feet on her case. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm doing everything I can. I can't lose my apartment. I don't have anywhere else to go." The officers sighed but didn't seem moved by her plea. "We're just following the protocol, ma'am. You should contact the landlord and see if there's any chance of making a payment arrangement. But we need to inform you that eviction proceedings will begin soon if the payment isn't received." With that, they left. Linda closed the door behind them, her hands trembling. The walls seemed to close in on her as she stood in the silence of her apartment. She had never imagined that it would come to this, standing face to face with the reality of losing everything she had worked for. It felt like the world was closing in around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, Linda sat on her couch, staring blankly at the TV, though she wasn't watching it. The officer's words echoed in her mind. Eviction proceedings. The phrase hung in the air like a constant reminder of how much she had lost. Her independence was slipping away. She wasn't just struggling to pay for insulin anymore. Now, she was fighting to keep a roof over her head. Her mind raced through 1,000 possible scenarios. What if she couldn't find a way to pay? What if she had to move out, go to a shelter, or live with family? The thought of losing her home, her space, felt unbearable. It wasn't just the rent, it was everything she had built for herself. The apartment had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she could be herself. Losing it would feel like losing her independence entirely. Linda wiped her eyes, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and defeat. She knew that she couldn't keep going like this. She had to find a way to make it through, but she didn't know how much longer she could keep up the fight. It was exhausting, and it felt like she was running out of options. Linda woke up to another gray morning, the kind that seemed to reflect the weight she carried. The sun struggled to break through the clouds outside her window, but she barely noticed. She had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the heavy feeling in her chest. The world outside seemed to continue as usual, cars rushing by, people walking on the sidewalk, but inside, Linda was drowning in the noise of her own thoughts. Yesterday had been a turning point. The visit from the police officers about her overdue rent had made her realize just how precarious her situation had become. She had thought that somehow, things would work out, that a solution would appear if she just kept pushing. But now, with eviction proceedings on the horizon and her disability benefits still nowhere in sight, Linda found herself questioning everything she had believed in. She had always been someone who could handle whatever life threw at her. She had worked hard to get where she was, kept her head down, paid her dues, and took pride in her independence. But now, that foundation felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure what to hold on to anymore. Linda made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the mug in her hands. The steam curled up from the cup, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The bills were stacked in front of her, but they felt insignificant now compared to the reality she was facing. She wasn't just worried about paying for insulin anymore. Now, it was about keeping her home. Her sense of security. The phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was her friend Jane, someone she had known for years. Linda hesitated before picking up. She didn't want to burden anyone with her problems, but she knew she needed someone to talk to. "Hey, Linda. How are you holding up?" Jane's voice was warm and comforting, a sharp contrast to the coldness Linda had been feeling. Linda forced a smile, though she knew Jane couldn't see it. "I'm managing, just dealing with a lot of stuff," she said quietly. "It's been hard." "I can imagine," Jane said sympathetically. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know. If you need anything at all, just let me know." Linda's heart squeezed in her chest. She had always been the one offering help, never asking for it. But now, with her back against the wall, she realized that Jane's offer was genuine. She didn't want to admit it, but she was running out of options. "I appreciate it, Jane." "I really do," Linda said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm so tired. Tired of not knowing how I'm going to make it. Every day feels like I'm fighting to stay afloat." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Linda could almost hear Jane thinking. "Linda," Jane finally said, "I know it's hard, but you can't keep carrying this alone. I don't know what else is going on, but I know you've got options. Maybe it's time to think about asking for more help. You've always been there for me. Don't be afraid to lean on us." Linda closed her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. She didn't want to admit it, but hearing Jane say those words hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, to feeling like she couldn't handle everything herself. But in that moment, Linda realized that maybe asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a step toward survival. The conversation ended shortly after, but Linda's mind was spinning. Jane's words had planted a seed of doubt in her, but not the kind she had been carrying for weeks. This wasn't doubt about whether things would get better, this was doubt about whether she could keep going the way she had been. The constant worrying, the pressure to keep everything together, it was suffocating. Linda wasn't sure how much longer she could live in this state of uncertainty, unable to even make plans for the next month. Her phone buzzed again, and Linda glanced at the screen. It was an email from SSA, and for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to open it. The thought of seeing another delay or another impersonal message about how they were still processing made her stomach twist. But something inside her urged her to open it. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today there would be a breakthrough. The subject line read, "Update on your disability claim." Linda clicked on it, her hands shaking slightly. The email was short, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "We regret to inform you that your disability claim is still pending. Due to the current backlog and staff reductions, we are unable to provide a timeline for when a decision will be made. We appreciate your patience." Her breath caught in her throat. Another dead end. Another reminder that the system was failing her. She felt the tears well up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She didn't want to cry. She had to hold it together. She had to figure out what to do next, but deep down, Linda knew that she couldn't keep doing this on her own. She couldn't keep fighting a battle with no end in sight. The reality of her situation was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like the fight was bigger than her. The days following Linda's realization that she couldn't keep fighting her battles alone were a turning point. She had spent so much time in isolation, pushing through her anxiety and fear in silence. Convinced that if she just kept moving forward, things would eventually get better. But now, for the first time in months, she began to allow herself to entertain the possibility that help was out there. She wasn't alone. There were resources, programs, and people who cared about her, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Linda spent the next few days looking into every assistance program she could find. She had always prided herself on being resourceful, and despite the frustration that had mounted over the past few weeks, she was determined to take action. She contacted various organizations, signed up for financial assistance programs, and even spoke with a social worker at her local community center. The calls were long, and the process was tedious, but there was a spark of hope now, hope that hadn't been there before. One morning, Linda woke up to an email notification. She had been checking her inbox constantly, but today, the subject line caught her attention: "Your application for emergency assistance has been approved." Her heart skipped a beat. She had applied for a small emergency grant to cover her rent, and though she hadn't expected anything back so soon, she clicked on the email with trembling hands. The email confirmed that she had been approved for a rent assistance program, which would cover the next 2 months of her rent. The relief was almost overwhelming. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was something that allowed her to breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. She read the email again, just to make sure she hadn't misinterpreted it. There it was, in black and white, approved. Linda leaned back in her chair, a feeling of warmth flooding over her. She could already feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. She could pay her rent. She could take a moment to breathe. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was drowning. The following days felt lighter. Linda paid her rent with the grant money and even allowed herself to pick up some groceries she had been skimping on for the past few weeks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. She no longer had to worry about whether she'd have a roof over her head at the end of the month, but as Linda basked in this small victory, there was still a nagging thought in the back of her mind. She had received help for now, but what about next month? And the month after that? Her disability claim was still pending, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for her benefits to be processed. This was just a temporary reprieve, one that didn't solve the larger issue. But for the first time, Linda allowed herself to savor the relief, even if only for a moment. She was still standing, still fighting, and that, in itself, was something worth celebrating. That evening, as Linda sat down to a simple dinner, she thought back to her conversation with Jane. Her friend had been right all along. Linda didn't have to do this alone. There were resources out there, and while it wasn't always easy to ask for help, it was a necessary step in this uncertain journey. The decision to reach out had been the hardest thing for Linda, but it had brought her the first real relief she'd felt in weeks. After dinner, Linda walked to the small window in her apartment and looked out at the city. The streetlights flickered on as the sun set, casting a soft glow over the buildings. The world outside felt vast and unpredictable, but Linda now saw it in a new light. She had made it through this hurdle. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but she was moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, there was hope in the future. The days following Linda's victory with the emergency rent assistance felt like a brief respite, a small moment of peace amid the storm. She had the breathing room she needed to reassess her situation, but the nagging questions still lingered in the back of her mind. The relief she felt from securing her rent for the next 2 months was overshadowed by the uncertainty of what would happen after that. The issue of her pending disability benefits was far from resolved, and Linda knew she couldn't keep relying on temporary solutions forever. As the days passed, Linda found herself back in the same routine of checking her phone and email, hoping for some update from SSA. But each notification was a disappointment. No news. No progress. The bureaucracy she had encountered seemed to stretch time, making every day feel like an eternity. One afternoon, after spending hours researching more financial assistance programs and calculating her budget, Linda found herself sitting in the small living room of her apartment. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. It should have been a peaceful moment, but all Linda could think about was the mounting pressure of what was coming next. The rent was taken care of, for now, but the rest of her life was still in limbo. It was then that Linda's phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something inside her urged her to pick up. She had learned to trust her gut lately. "Hello?" She answered cautiously, "Hello, Ms. Carter." The voice on the other end was warm but businesslike. "This is Olivia from the Social Security Administration. I'm calling regarding your disability claim." Linda's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the call she had been waiting for? "Ms. Carter, I wanted to inform you that we've processed your claim, and we've approved your application for benefits. You'll be receiving your first payment in the next 2 weeks." For a moment, Linda was stunned. She sat there in silence, the words ringing in her ears. Approved. She had expected more delays, more waiting, but here it was, the breakthrough she had been desperately hoping for. It wasn't just a victory in paperwork, it was a lifeline. She would have the financial security she had been struggling to maintain. A safety net that would allow her to move forward without constantly looking over her shoulder. "Thank you," Linda said, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know what to say. This is a huge relief." "I understand, Ms. Carter," Olivia replied. "We know how difficult things have been for you. We'll make sure your payments are processed quickly moving forward. Is there anything else I can assist you with today?" Linda shook her head, even though the person on the other end of the line couldn't see her. "No, that's all. Thank you again." As she hung up the phone, a wave of relief washed over Linda, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. The uncertainty, which had gripped her for so many months, had finally loosened its hold. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but this was a crucial step forward. The weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders had been lifted, even if just for now. Linda stood up from the couch and walked to the window, gazing out at the street below. The world outside felt different, as though the possibilities were opening up once again. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was moving forward. She still had challenges to face, but she had the tools and the resources to face them head-on. For the first time in months, Linda felt a flicker of hope for the future, but as she looked out the window, the thought that had been following her for weeks crept back into her mind. What if the future was still uncertain? What if more challenges came, bigger than the ones she had already faced? The thought was unsettling, but Linda knew that she could no longer live in fear of what might happen. The fight wasn't over, but she had already proven to herself that she had the strength to navigate the storm. She wasn't done yet. With newfound resolve, Linda turned away from the window. There was still more to do, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had a support system, and she had the power to keep going, no matter what.